you had the meter sticks on the board, you were mentioning that as we make this concept more precise, have more strict criteria for what counts as a meter, that we're getting a more reliable concept.
Yeah.
And was that just for that particular case, or is the idea supposed to be that even if you take the concept of a cat and you make it more well-defined and more precise, it's going to be more reliable?
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay.
So take any concept and notice first that it's going to play a role in a conceptual economy, right? That in the simplified picture is shaped by the psychology of the concept using being. So these concepts are apt for achieving the goal of such a being. So keep it simple, right? We're looking at like kind of ideal types. So if you're an ideal appetitive person, then you'll want your concepts to divide the world up in ways that contribute to, or best contribute to, your achieving your appetitive money-making ends. And that means that those concepts will be fitted to a picture of the world that's like, where the good is that, that's what Sappho is, that's the good. So the world, the concepts that I'm going to use are for the purposes of dividing up the world so as to get that. Right? That's the thought. Yeah.
So does the timocrat or the oligarch have a more reliable concept of money, how to make, money making or just money? Because presumably, further down we go, the better our concepts are going to be, but there's some plausibility thinking, no, if you really want to know what money is or money making, go.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah. So so let me postpone it slightly because though it's going to be tied to questions that we still have a very hard time answering, which are intra and interpersonal measures of utility, for example. So. Right, because look, here's what's crucial. Suppose for a moment, just pretend that they're going to be currencies in which we're going to finally work. They're going to be currencies in which we're going to finally sort of work out the bottom lines of all of this. Right? Well, it better not be that I get to rig the currency, right? So if I get to establish the value of the coinage, then when we do the math, I come up with the biggest sum. If you get to do it, it comes out that you have the biggest sum. So we're going to need a coin of the realm, right, that we have good reason to think is not fixed by arbitrary claims. This is just another way of telling the ideological contamination story. Mm-hmm. Right? There's got to be, at the end of the day, we've got to be able to say we're objectively better off. Right? Not that we believe we are because we've been sold a bill of goods. We have to have some reason to think that we're actually tracking the truth. Okay. That's the thought. Yes. So you're dead right. We've got to be confident that the measurements of accuracy relative to goals, we can discern what good goals are from bad goals without succumbing to a Trotsky-Nikian challenge. Okay. So I think the takeaway, a very important, so this is what I think. Here's what I think it is to understand a philosophy. It's to kind of get so that you can predict what they will say. So at the point where you can think something like this, so if they were to consider this problem, what do I think they would say about it? And I think they'd probably say something like this. And so one of the things that, happened with me and Plato is that I started predicting things and then finding them, right? So then you think, oh, that's really good because I thought this would have to appear somewhere as a problem, and look, here it is. And so that's a very good way to sort of think, right? That you can get to the point where you can sort of see what's going on in the philosopher. So you'll see that Plato is going to try, aware that there are these kinds of problems, that he'll beg the question against Thrasymachus, right? Mm-hmm. That's crucial that he not do that he fall back into the Socratic thing of, no, our concepts are the right ones, right? So we need a way to say whose concepts are the right ones. That isn't itself simply a self-fulfilling prophecy. So but the thought I want you to have, that I think is a really first-rate thought of Plato's, is, so he takes a very simple Humean, if he doesn't know it's Humean, he takes a very simple Humean picture, a very simple Socratic picture, actually. They're a kind of belief, desire, psychology. And then he sees that you can make that do an incredible amount of work in terms of creating psychic structures. So it's not just as if the psyche stays flat under the influence of these two things. It's that you can see that you've got the resources to build psychic components that are very complicated, even though you start with these very simple resources. As soon as you think that what concepts you'll develop are a result of cognitive developments that are desire-driven, you're already on your way to being able to start whistling the tune, even if you don't get all of the details right. So let's take a look at the cave for a second, and say that in the cave, you remember one of the most famous images. It starts, and people often don't see it. So, the cave is intended to illustrate the effects of education on us. And he says, we're like them. We're like the cave dwellers. And so, it's, when you first read it, I think it's very hard to understand what holds the cave dwellers in the cave. Why is it that some people are tethered there, so to speak, looking at these images and they can't get up? What psychologically is it? Is that they're tied to a chair by somebody? Or is it there's something about them that makes it difficult for them? So something about their psychologies. And you can see what the story is now, right? It's got to be this, that as we move out of the cave, the desires that ruin us change. So education is targeted not primarily simply at what we might think of as pure cognition, if we knew what that was, but rather it's targeted at turning the soul around. Right? So that is replacing the rule of one set of desires by the rule of another set of desires. So the thought is, if education can get you out of the cave of just going on, right, using the cognitive resources that can't distinguish between the shadow of a human being, a statue of a human being, a real human being, it can't discriminate those. The difference is, right, concealed or occluded or erased once you project it as a shadow. There's no difference between the shadow of a man, the shadow of a statue, the shadow, right? They're all at the level of shadows. That level of conceptual discrimination is lost. So first we get, right, images of concepts, sort of, as it were, what the world would be like if your concepts painted it. If you painted the world in accord with your concept of a man, you would get the shadows on the cave wall. Right? When you're released from your necessary appetites, so only part gets represented because, as we discover in the Callipolis, there's no room for people like this. These are the psychopaths from the point of view of the Callipolis because they can't escape repetitive rule. Right? See, or rather, they can't get rid of the bad appetites, the ones that are not psychopaths. It's only these three that get represented in the Callipolis. The others have been filtered out. So here are the bound cave dwellers, right? Tethered, looking at shadows by their necessary appetites. Then those appetites through education are released and they're turned around, and now they see the statues. So all their concepts have gotten better, right? Because now they can discriminate between the shadow and the statue. So, right, they can tell that that's not a man, this is a statue. Of course, they're wrong, but they're better than they were. Now they escape the cave and they see the things themselves. So now they've got, right now they're tethered by their rational desires, right? They're free, as Plato will say, because freedom and rule by reason are going to be identified. Now they're here, so they see, right, the things themselves. These see the wooden statues. These see the shadow. So the cave is intended to give us a picture of the difference between the level of reliability of the conceptual resources of the beings we have under the influence of education. Those who are able, right, move till they're got an adequate concept of what a human being is, one that discriminates the shadow from the statue from the thing itself. So as you move up, you enrich your concept of what a human being is or anything, and so that now you're actually drawing, as Plato will say, you're cutting nature at the joints with your concepts. Your concept of anything actually carves it where it should be, whereas when you move down, you carve, but you miss some of the joints, and when you go down further, you miss even more of the joints. The line then moves us from the cave and its imagistic picture to a better characterization of what the cognitive resources are. So I come up with names for these, but perceptual thought, right? This is a level of thought that's enriched by training, so maybe it's sort of a discriminating eye, but it's still pretty imagistic. Then we move to a level of, what do I call it?
Folk wisdom?
Yeah, so now we've got more resources, and then we finally get to, so we go perceptual thought, folk wisdom, scientific thought, dialectical thought, 4 levels. Okay, so uneducated, perceptual thought, first level of education, we're already in the cave, now we've got folk wisdom, then we move to scientific thought, that's pretty good, then we finally get to dialectical thought. We don't have to worry about that yet, right? We just have to say that this is how we're looking at cognitive capacities that have been produced by a system of education that replaces relatively unreliable standards with more reliable ones. And much of the, so here's a way to think about it. Think about knowledge carves the world at the joints, right? As if you know something is so it is. So belief can be true or false. So if you've got some beliefs, sometimes they're true, sometimes they're false. You can have a degree of reliability in your belief. That's the way in which we make the connection to epistemology, so to speak, of this. And the line says, right, it tries to give us a way of measuring, right, or representing the kind of degree of belief or the degree of reliability that's present. I don't want to go into the details of that right now. I just want to say that that's what's going on in the line. So when we take, for example, here's a nice one. So suppose we're trying, so this is the example that Plato gives. So look, if we're trying to decide which finger is longer, perception will give us a pretty good answer to that question. Right? But when we try to talk about what's the difference between bigger and smaller, not the bigger finger on the smaller one, but the difference between bigger and smaller, perception won't do it anymore. We need other resources. Here's the thought. All right, so let's look at 2 lines. So suppose, now I can see that A is larger than B, and so can you, right? So, and we're right. If we were to measure it, we'd turn out the perceptual thought was right about it. And now I say, okay, so I understand that A is bigger than B, and B is smaller than A. But what is it to be bigger than or smaller than? I want to grip on the concepts that I just utilized in making that judgment. And I say, well, look, I've presented you with it. You can see from this image what it is to be bigger than or smaller than. Now, think about how you would do it, right? So what you have to do is you have to introduce the notion of because this produces, this is what Plato says, this presents bigger and smaller mixed up together, not separate the way they are for the mind. Why? Well, because that same image, if I say, show me what bigger is, I show you this. And you say, show me what smaller is, and I show you this again. Well, I want you to look at it in a certain way, right? I want you to order the lines. But notice that that requires you to have the concept of order to bring to bear on it, so that you actually already understand where you're supposed to, how you're supposed to look. So now I've got the problem of how to present you with order. But when I try to do that by presenting you with an ordered series, the same objection will respond, right? I have to know which direction to take the ordered series in. So now I have to present you with a picture of direction. So here's the famous example from Wittgenstein, which I'm sure you all remember. What is that a picture of? And the answer is, it's a picture of a man walking up a hill with a staff. And Wittgenstein says, well, actually, you know, there's a society where they have this sport where you have to stand on a slope holding a thing like this, and then you have to slide down backwards holding the position. Why isn't it a picture of that? Now, that's the thought is, pictures don't interpret themselves. And therefore, while there are some things that you can get by getting a picture of, there are other things that you can only get if you know how to interpret the picture. So you can't be primitively learning them by being presented with the picture, because that'll only help you if you know how to interpret it. And that's just what's at issue, right? That's the very thing you're supposed to be trying to learn. So the same will apply with the lines, right? Mm-hmm. So you can think, I say, look, that's what it is to be bigger. And you take, B is bigger than A. Right? And that's wrong. That's like thinking that this is a picture of a guy climbing the hill with a staff, when really it's a picture of him sliding down the hill backwards. And if I say it's both, and of course it could be, right? So think of this, right? I want to give you a picture of a person climbing a hill, but I only have this picture of a guy sliding down the hill backwards. But you don't know much about that society and that sport, so this is going to give you, and I show you this, and you think, oh, I see. The same picture embodies both, and therefore it can't discriminate between the two. That's the point. So when we try to do for bigger and smaller what we did for seeing one finger to be bigger than another, we discovered that we instantly move out of the perceptual into a different area, right? And so what Plato says is, right, and then, right, seeing that perception presents you with one thing and its opposite mixed up together, bigger and smaller mixed up together, it calls in thought, it summons thought to help it do what perception by itself can't do, right? And that, so now we've moved from, so if you want to know what a shoe is, and I show you that, that can be good enough. But if I want to show you what beautiful is, I won't be able to do it in the same way, because anything I present, while it will be beautiful in one context, will be ugly in another, right? Same with small or big, and the whole, anything where, right, you won't get one thing rather than its opposite by being presented with the image. You have to acquire in a different way, right? You've got to get it from thought. So, right, that's the thought. So the first, when we look at the end of book 5, and we'll look at where the philosopher is introduced for the first time, right? Plato says, okay, well, why can't we just, what's the difference, he says, between philosophers and sight lovers, right? And he tells this little story, I'm sure you remember it, about the bat and the bird and the stick and the tree, and there's a pile of stuff about how belief is set over what is and what is not, right? And knowledge is set over what is, and ignorance is set over what is not. Don't worry, we're going to come back to it. But right, and the thought is, you can't be. Is there any one, he says, of these many beauties that is not also equally non-beautiful? And therefore, being presented with an image won't do the trick for you with those, because each one is one that you can get the negative from. Right? I show you this and I say, that's beautiful, and you take it to be not beautiful, and you're right. Just as much as you'd be right if you took it the other way. Right? Because this picture won't partition the world into two groups, those who are climbing hills and those who are sliding down backwards. So you need something else. And the something else that comes in is then, so perceptual thought itself, and the presenting to you of perceptual paradigms, measuring devices that are perceptual, right? That would work for some things, but it won't work, and especially won't, for these value notions that are at the target. But it also won't work for big and small and other kinds of things. So what would work? And the thought is, well, thought. You need to bring in theoretical notions and concepts. Look again at our meter stick. We started with a perceptual meter, right? Here it is. That's it. And then we thought, that's not good enough, right? Because it contracts and expands. And then we think, okay, so how are we going to get a better one? And we instantly are forced into theory, right? Because in order to get a more reliable standard, we have to study the laws of contraction and things. We have to know about, we have to do a whole big load of science in order to figure out how to move from the regular old piece of stick that any one of us can go and buy in the store, and the standard meter, which is a more elaborate version of that, to the wavelength of light. Right? That's a huge set of changes that have gone in sophistication. We've moved out of the perceptual into the theoretical. And the idea is you can't provide standards at the level of perception for notions like just, right, wrong, good, or long, short, and a whole lot of others. You've got to go to theory. Are you with me? Kind of? I mean, you don't have to get all the details, just enough to get the flavor of the thought for now. Okay, so, and then the next step is, okay, so suppose we go to mathematics. So, right, here's perception. And perception fails, and you can actually see this. So Wittgenstein was very taken up with these kinds of questions, because here's the theory that was lying in the background. Concepts are little inner pictures. They're perceptual things, right? Think of Locke, right? Abstract general ideas, right? They're just kind of pictures. And you go around with them like you would with a paint chip, and you discover matches. That's what's going on. And Wittgenstein's private language argument and all those kinds of things is directed against that. Right? It says, no, how would you know? Right? So it's pushing on a view that's very much like this. The duck rabbit is like this too. How do you know that these things have aspects? They can switch aspects. How do you know that the aspect is staying fixed? Right? So suppose you're my duck rabbit, okay? Okay, so remember the duck rabbit. That's not a duck rabbit. Stop knocking that damn thing. Okay, so here's the. That's not good.
What is it supposed to be? Better?
That's better, right? So this is a picture of a duck rabbit. If you look at it in a certain way, those are the rabbit's ears. If you look at it a different way, that's the beak of the duck, right? That's the thumb. Now, suppose that your concepts were all pictures, okay? But the pictures were all like duck rabbits. So that if you projected them one way, right, focused on one side of them, you'd pick out all and only the ducks. And if you focused up on the other way, you'd pick out all and only the rabbits. But the aspects keep shifting on you, right? So until I give you that instruction in a way such that you know which aspect to look at, the picture is no good to you. And the idea that pictures can shift aspects so that therefore they're poor guides is just another way of attacking the picture image. Plato, by the way, does exactly the same thing in the Phaedo. At the end of the Phaedo, he says, look, whatever our standards of beauty or justice or whatever are, they've got to be things that no matter what perspective you take on them, they always present the very same thing. So it can't be that when you look at justice from one picture, it looks like a duck, and from another, it looks like a rabbit, because then it's no good for Plato. So he sort of got that idea. All right. So now we move from perception to theory. So science. So now we're at the level of not the meter stick, but the wavelength of light, right? And we've got a background theory that tells us that's invariant. So notice that it's not, we can't measure it and say, oh yeah, it's invariant, because that would be to use the meter stick to measure the wavelength when we want to do it the other way around. So what we have to do is have a theory that tells us, no, that's invariant. And that's not a measurement, right? In the sense that we go and measure the thing. That's follows from the theory that this wavelength never alters. So now we go to scientific theory, and we're going to use, as our model of scientific theory, we're going to use Euclid's geometry. And the reason for that is that when Plato was writing, that's the most articulate version of any science, right? So this is an axiom system. On which we've got axioms and then theorems. And we get the theorems from the axioms by rules of inference. Familiar to all of you who've taken elementary logic, right? So this could be the first order predicate calculus or something like that. Axiomatized. And then that's how we do it, right? We generate the theorems from the axioms using the rules of inference. Once you've got a system like this in place, the question is, what would we say about it that would raise the same kinds of problems as we raised for perception?
Well, just going back to the whole wavelength of light, there's like sufficient evidence to believe that wavelengths change based on our observation of them. So like it seems that the theory still depends on observation, which is again perception.
Well, it's true that the theory is going to be based on observation, but notice that it's not circular in the way that you said, because it's not. This is what's not true is this, that the theories claim that the wavelength is invariant is one that we test by measuring it with meters. Rather, what's true is on other grounds, other observational grounds, we have reason to favor the theory, which now generates this outcome over here. So we don't go around in a narrow circle, but you're absolutely right. That is, still though, what's very important is that in moving from perception to theory, right, we leave behind certain kinds of concepts to replace them by other kinds of concepts. So we're no longer constructing our concepts simply out of observational materials. We're allowed to construct them out of a whole lot of other resources as well, including things like inferences and so on. So it's true that, right, at some point we've got to say, this is a very well-supported theory, and that's going to rely on a whole lot of measurements, but that won't affect our standard for the meter stick, provided that we're not covertly, sort of pushing that. But that would be a good, so we'd have to say, okay, the observational input to the theory can't be such that it's subject to undercutting, right? So that would be, so let's take it, it's very much easier to see this if we do it again in terms of ideology. So the worry is not that the theory is observation-based. The worry is that the observations are theory contaminated. So the thought is, right, you're running your finger around the circle because you've actually, the theory is setting up the observations for you in ways that make it look like it corroborates the theory. That would be the ideological contamination theory. And as long as that's not a form of skepticism, that is simply, you can never know anything because look, right? Then it's subject to just the ordinary ways of responding. You don't have to have an anti-skeptical theory. You can say, no, actually, these are reliable observations. This is a good way to go. This works. This does this. And that's going to be fine for that. As long as you can do that, it's okay. So here's the way to do it, right? Even when you do different theories, even when you start with very different theoretical backgrounds, these things remain stable. So for example, new theories have to imply the approximate truth of old ones. So it's not as if you've got all these different theories and they're just competitors. They all have a lot of, like they all have math in their background. So the way you do the equations and the way you do the math, that's not observation-based, and it's required by all the theories. So a way to think of it is not, oh, you've got to have absolutely uncontaminated data. What's true is you've got to have a way of ensuring that your data is not infecting your theory. One way you can do that is by seeing that the same data, the same measurements, the same things are given by a whole lot of different theories. So it's not, the data, the observations are not dependent on you accepting only one theory. These actually are invariant across many theories. And of course, math is like that across a whole lot of theories. So anyway, but that is a real worry. How do we build a theory? So hold that. There's another one though, which is if you set your theory up this way, right, as an axiom system, there's going to be a question of the cognitive status of the axioms. So think of these as starting points from which if you get them too directly from observation, there'll be a worry. If you think that they're self-evident, that'll be a worry, because the self to whom they're evident is a socially constructed self. You have to worry. There might be a solution, but you have to worry about it, right? And that's exactly what Plato is going to attack. So right at the end of book 6, having looked at the mathematicians, he says, well, I mean, they're terrific at moving from assumptions or hypotheses to conclusions. But if you ask them how to prove the hypotheses, they really don't have anything to say about that. And so, right, that's not going to give us knowledge because that's all just untethered, right? Or just hanging off hypotheses that are no better than they should be. And now, so the next question is, how could we render them unhypothetical? So that's where that's going to go. Okay. So when we look at the line, right, perceptual thought gives rise to folk theory. That's beyond just eyeballing it to measuring the king's arm. Folk theory gives rise to scientific thought. And scientific thought gives rise to, well, the next thing, which Plato calls dialectic. And we're not going to talk about that yet, right? That's the progress. So what we have to think is, you start over here with relatively, this is again, go back to our Humean subject, thinking about developing her cognitive resources. She's got some desires and some beliefs. And she's got a kind of desire side to her, the cognitive, and a belief side to her, the cognitive. And she thinks, right, oh, look, I've got this desire to develop my cognitive resources. And we don't have to give an explanation for that. We could, but she just finds that she's got it, right? And now her desire drives her to develop her cognitive resources. So she starts with perceptual thought, right? She is able to form beliefs in the way that we do with untutored perception. Mm-hmm. Then she takes a step, right? She gets socialized into a way of seeing the world that is the folk way, the way that we all do. Before we get any specialized training, we learn a language, and in that language, right, is embodied a kind of folk theory of the world. Go ahead.
So sorry, would qualities sit in perception then?
Yeah.
Like okay,
Yeah.
just to make sure.
Yes. So, right, I invent a bit of vocabulary to keep these things kind of clear, but the idea, okay, so now you've got a little more cognitive sophistication, and with it, more conceptual articulation. You've moved from the shadows to the statues, right? Now you go get some scientific training, and you move from the statues to something yet better. But you're not quite you're out of the cave, but you're not quite in the sun, because there's another layer outside the cave, right? So now when we match the cave onto the line, right here's the line, we've got two things that are invisible, that's the cave, right? So those and these. And then we've got two things that are in the intelligible, which are these and these, and this is the visible. And that corresponds to the story we were telling. Right? Perception utilizes untutored observation to look at the world and form its views. It gets socialized, that's folk theory, right? Then it gets further educated in, let's say, science. Then it replaces some of the folk theoretical concepts with richer and better scientific ones. And then there's a mysterious upper layer that looks at the scientific things and says they're not the final solution either. And then we're going to save that one for later. We need to put more in place to do that.
Just a general question. I mean, how is it guaranteed that the intelligible levels are not themselves subject to some sort of ideological contamination?
Yeah, so here I think it's very important. This I think it's something that it's hard to keep in mind, especially if you're a philosopher, right? Because it's very difficult to distinguish between detectable and correctable ideological contamination from detectable but potentially incorrectable skeptical worries. So remember, think of it dialectically, right? So rather than thinking there's an absolute here, think of it as there's a dialectical situation in which Thrasymachus says, I have pierced the veil of illusion. I've seen through the ideological contamination, and I'll tell you what justice really is. It's the interest of the stronger. So now if you're on the other side, you think, well, if you can see through the damn veil of illusion, so can I. Right? So you can't tell me you're the only one to be able to do it. I've got to be able to do it too. So my goal isn't to do this. It isn't to produce a story that is skeptic is going to be happy with. It isn't even to produce one that the moral skeptic, like Thrasymachus, is going to be happy with. It's rather to produce one that I can be happy with, that meets reasonable standards of for achieving its goal. So it's not in any sense obviously ideologically contaminated. And the way I'm going to do that is as follows, right? So the cave is the area of contamination. It's the area in which, right, ideologies function, right? It's the city, the down there, right? And what I have to do is construct from there a place that I can plausibly represent as not subject to those forces. So let's look at Thrasymachus. He says, the powerful rule, they make laws in their own interest, they declare obedience to those laws to be just for their subjects, end of story, right? So what I have to do is say, okay, I see how that works here. That's going to be the realm with the Thrasymachus realm. And my question is, how do I escape it? That realm. Okay, well, here's how I do it. Well, I notice, for example, that within that realm, there are things that are not subject to that control. And there must be, on Thrasymachus' view, because he himself has escaped it. And the thought is, how do you do that? Well, there are things that, right, the rulers couldn't possibly control because they don't know enough to control them. So for example, think how absurd it would be to say that algebra is under the control of the government. Right? You think, well, first, they're not. I mean, that would be a bit like, say, the problem with hacking, right? As the thought that the government can't even ensure the security of its own computer systems because they're really clever people, and they really, all they think is, oh, you think I can't get in there? Sure I can. Right? And boom, see? And that's just what you do when you penetrate get behind a firewall. You've gotten in through a layer of ideology that's pretty substantial. And so what Thrasymachus, what Plato sees is there's a very well-developed mathematical science that nobody thinks is ideologically contaminated. There's no reason to believe that the kinds of forces that Thrasymachus has introduced as distorting could play any role there, right? Why? Well, the rulers are rulers. They're human beings. They're not algebraists, right? They don't have the understanding of those things to do it, and you can test them on it to see. It's just obvious that they don't know enough economics, they don't know enough geometry, and that's just an empirically available result. You can see that they don't have it. And if they were to say that they had superior technology that you didn't know anything about, then your capacity to hack their firewall would show them they didn't have it. So these are empirical claims, right? This is not skepticism. The thought is, if you can show me that I am subject to these contaminatory forces, then I've got to take that seriously, and that's what Thrasymachus does. But equally well, he's got to concede that there are things that are not subject to them, because he's escaped. And here's a very plausible candidate, mathematical science and the like, because these are bodies of knowledge constructed to be minimally subject to such forces. In fact, their universities and research systems are constructed to hive off little areas of life from direct government control and influence in order to get on with that. They don't have to do it perfectly, but even the government, in order to run its control system, better do its math right. There's a whole set of stuff that you just can't trick with. So there's a famous New Yorker cartoon in the 60s. No, Joey, even here at the alternative school, 2 + 2 is 4. Right? This thought is, yeah, there's stuff, we don't do, but math, I'm afraid, is just the same here as it is over in the bad old government school, and you still have to learn it, right? And that's the thought. It's very simple. So that's the way to think is, can we build a bridge, a starting point that we have good grounds for thinking is not subject to ideological contamination. It doesn't have to be free from, refute the dreaming critique or something.
And
is the hope that the analogy from mathematics is somehow going to carry over when we think about things like justice or more controversial topics?
That's the idea. Yeah, so the thought would be, once we recognize that science can focus on any of the things that folk wisdom can focus on, but folk wisdom does it from within the cave, and science does it from outside, then we have reason to think that there's a way to get at those same things that is not in the same way subject. Right? So just as in the case of psychology, right, where without really noticing it, Thrasymachus operates with the view of the soul as consisting of appetites only. We take a step away from that when we say, but actually there are other things in the soul too. And that's something we have access to, right? We don't need a big elaborate story about that. So there we've already taken a step away, and with it, we've provided some of the resources, psychological resources, for the next bit, right? Because if we've also got rational desires and so on, then within the soul, so to speak, there's something that is minimally subject to the influence of appetite, or not as wholly under its control. Yeah.
Okay, so at least part of what we're doing when we have this Euclidean axiomatic system is learning the ambiguity and the interpretability of a picture, right?
Yeah.
But presumably the same Wittgenstein would say the same worry recurs, right? You have an axiomatic system where you say, okay, go on, and the question's how? So there's some ambiguity there. Is the answer is the person who knows how to go on is the geometer?
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. So there are a series of arguments that we can raise about a scientific theory, and in a way, all of those arguments are going to be ones to which Plato is friendly, because he doesn't think science is the last word. Science is our word, right? It's out of the cave, but it's not yet all the way to the sun. It's just, it sees shadows in brightly colored surfaces and so forth, but it hasn't gotten all the way to adequate concepts yet. And then we have to ask, is the strategy from which we'll get from scientific thought to dialectical thought going to be subject to the same worries or not? So you're right, that's absolutely right. What science is it's the first stopping point outside the cave that we have good reason to think is minimally subject to the kinds of distorting forces that Thrasymachus has introduced. We don't have to make it free from all distorting forces, because really what we want to do is to say, we've escaped that. And that's a particular strategic intervention into Socratic ways of doing philosophy. But it says, we can't do it that way, because look, here's an argument against it. I don't have to take care of everything. I just have to say, well, this is not subject to that. There may be other words, but not that one. Any other? This is a lot of material. I understand that, but we won't be adding more and more and more material. We'll just be kind of boring deeper and deeper into this material. So I know you're all doing the reading, but the reading for next week, I think it's, does anyone have a syllabus? I think that's same again, okay. So if you haven't already, I'll check to make sure that this is on there. But there's a paper in Blindness and Reorientation, which is, I believe, it used to be called Blindness and Reorientation, but I think I've changed the title of it. Education and the Acquisition of Knowledge, Chapter 7. And so what we're going to do now is that replaces some of the stuff in Philosopher Kings that's overly complicated, I think. It's to look at the argument at the end of Book 5 on what distinguishes a philosopher from a craft worker, and then start on to Book 6, where we get the Lion and Cave on what's wrong with mathematics. So that'll help with that story. And what I'd like to do now is, we've got the kind of broad picture. want to look at the text and make sure that that's what's in there. Okay?